Hello, so welcome to the licensing hearing on the 30th of September 2024. To start the meeting, the subcommittee need to elect a chair, and I've understood they've elected Councillor Villiers. Is that correct?
It is.
Yeah. So I'll pass over to Councillor Villiers to chair.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. So this is the premises licensing review for Museum Gardens. I'd like to introduce, I'm Councillor Villiers, and with me on the committee today, I have Councillor Baxter and Councillor Kilbane, who is standing in for Councillor Cuthbertson, who sends his apologies. We have Helen Sefton as our Senior Licensing Officer, Rhys Williams, Democracy Officer, Jodie Ingram, Legal Officer. We have the applicant with us, Andrew Dickinson, licence holder, represented by Michelle Hazelwood, and our Public Protection Officer, Michael Golightly. So, are there any declarations of interest from anyone today? Okay. Exclusion of press and public. We need to make a resolution when we get to the deliberations. Are we excluding press and public? Yep, so we will be excluding the press and public for the deliberations. The minutes of the last meeting, none of us who are on the committee were at the last meeting, so we can't approve those minutes. We will hold them over to the next committee meeting. Right, so we'll move on to the main item today, the determination of the application. Does everyone understand the procedure that we're going to go through? So we will have each representative in turn, and they will be given 20 minutes to make their representation. And then after that, there will be 5 minutes for the applicant, the licence holder, and the Public Protection Officer to ask any questions, and for any amount of time for the subcommittee to ask questions. And we will go with the licensing officer's report first, then the applicant, and then the licence holder. Is everyone happy? Yeah. Okay. So I've got on here the licensing officer's report. Yes. So yes, sorry. Yes. So yeah, we're going to start with the senior licensing officer's report, Helen Sefton. Okay. Yeah, Helen.
Thank you. Good morning, everybody. So this is an application for the review of a premises licence made by Mr. Andrew Dickinson. The application for review relates to the licensing objective of the prevention of public nuisance. A copy of the review application can be seen at Annex 1 of the pack, and that starts at page 27. To briefly summarise the review application. Following a live music event at the Museum Gardens over the weekend of the 18th, 19th and 20th of July, the applicant raised complaints with the Public Protection team at City of York Council in relation to noise from the events on the 19th and 20th of July. He states he was advised by an environmental health officer that the permitted noise levels had been exceeded by 2 dB and that the EHO advised that this increase would not be noticeable. The applicant would like to see suitable noise limits imposed and enforced if the venue is permitted to hold such events in the future. He believes the thresholds permitted were too high and were not adhered to. He also states that the centre of York is not a suitable location for outdoor music events. He would like to see the imposition of an additional condition on the licence to prevent a reoccurrence of the noise. For background information, the Museum Gardens has held a premises licence first issued by the Licensing Authority at City of York Council since September 2005. The licence is held by York Museums Trust, and the designated premises supervisor named on that licence is Richard Sorwood. The licence authorises the sale of alcohol for consumption on the premises from 11 AM until 10:45 PM, and the provision of regulated entertainment, and that is plays, films, live music, recorded music, and performance of dance from 9 AM to 10:30 PM every day of the week. A copy of the current licence can be found at Annex 2, starting at page 33, through to page 45. I can confirm that the consultation process for this review application was carried out correctly. A further representation was received from the Public Protection team at the City of York Council, and details of that representation appear at Annex 3. There were also 24 representations received from other persons. Of those, 2 wrote in support of the review application and 22 wrote in support of the premises licence holder. A list of those representatives is attached at Annex 4 of the private pack, and a copy of the representations appears at Annex 5 of the public pack. A map showing the general area around the premises is found at Annex 6. Additional information has been provided and circulated by the solicitor representing the premises licence holder, and that has been circulated to you all as an agenda supplement. In addition, a further email from the Public Protection Officer, Mr. Golightly, has also been provided and circulated as an agenda supplement. So today the committee has the following options when making your decision. Option 1 is to modify the conditions of the licence, and that would be to alter, omit or add any new condition. Option 2 is to exclude a licensable activity from the scope of the licence. Option 3 is to remove the designated premises supervisor. Option 4 is to suspend the licence for a period not exceeding 3 months. Option 5 is to revoke the licence. And option 6 is to take no action. Members may determine that no further action is appropriate and they do not require any further steps to be taken. There is nothing to prevent members issuing a formal warning to the licence holder. That is my report, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. So I'm going to give opportunity in turn for people to ask questions. So first of all, I'd like to ask the applicant, Andrew Dickinson. Would you like to ask any questions?
Do you want to just...
Sorry. Yeah, as I say, this is the first time I've been to one of these, so apologies, I'm not too familiar with the process. I wasn't aware I could ask questions, but it would be interesting to know if there had been any noise complaints. You said it was from 2005, if there'd been any noise complaints from then until recently, or if this had been an issue over some 15, 20 years. Or if you have that.
Noise complaints would be dealt with by my colleagues in the Public Protection team. Michael is here to be able. You just turn yourself, sorry. To be able to answer for such a long period from 2005, I wouldn't be able to answer those off the top of my head. We would have to sort of do some research to find out how many complaints there had been. I couldn't answer that right now.
Thank you. Do you have any other questions?
No.
Okay, thank you. And now the licence holder, would you like to ask any questions? Okay, and Public Protection Officer, no. Anyone from the subcommittee, any questions? Okay, right, so we'll move on to the applicant's case. So Andrew Dickinson, you have 20 minutes to present your case.
The event started in the early hours and lasted until around 10:30 in the evening. Then again the following night. For over 6 hours of a balmy summer evening, the time when residents would like to relax and breathe and enjoy the peaceful enjoyment, our evening was blighted by these outdoor music events. The amenity of York residents was for nothing for those few who attended this event. Nobody asked us. Who could we complain to? What effect did they have on us? Nobody asked. Now, it is impressive that there were over 20 comments submitted supporting this music event, but, and this is a very important point, almost all of these comments were either from the employees of the event or individuals who attended the event, or from those outside York who came to visit One wonders if there was an element of commercial bias in these comments and a desire for future concerts to be held here, which would surely be untenable in the centre of a residential area. Sadly, if you live in around the area of Museum Gardens and had been affected by this event, you'd probably have little idea that a licence review had been demanded, unless, of course, you happen to notice the small piece of paper fixed to the railings or routinely check the council website. Not a common hobby with your average resident. Now, it must be noted that despite this, several of the residents did complain about the noise at the time of the event, and several others also supported my application for review. One resident made a very important point that they were affected not only by the noise from the event itself, but also from the practice sessions, which prolonged the noise and made sitting in the garden untenable for most of that weekend. Surely this isn't fair. My next point is in relation to the Environmental Protection Officer comments. It's also worth noting that these are planned to be held regularly from the submission, so 6 times per year, presumably over the summer period, which is why I say rigorous noise prevention measures should be in place in such a residential area where there are children and elderly. Mr. Gallagher states they are permission to operate at 65 decibels. She asserts is a reasonable level. I assert that is far from a reasonable level because it caused such disruption and discomfort for such a prolonged period. Now, the Noise Council have produced a code of practice which states that the use of some arbitrary decibel value underestimates the intrusiveness of low frequency noise and that additional controls should be used. It also states that these low frequency noises can be heard at a far greater distance. And this is essentially the main issue, where these constant low frequencies emanating some considerable distance from the venue, and that the noise measuring technique used was insufficient. It was insufficient because it only measures the noise around the immediate site, and insufficient because it is simply an arbitrary dB value, which doesn't meet the Noise Council's recommendations and requirements, in that it fails to assess the impact of the constant low frequency noises. I would urge the committee to follow something similar to what Manchester Council have in place, where the noise from such events cannot exceed predefined threshold levels above that of background noise. And Manchester Council also, and this is very important, they state in their policy that if this site for outdoor music events is surrounded by residential properties, then they say that may not be appropriate, unless, of course, their strict control measures are implemented. And this really is the point, that if these events are to continue, there needs to be acceptance of the potential impact on local residents and that adequate noise mitigation measures are adopted. Simply responding that it's too difficult to provide these measures is not good enough. If adequate noise mitigation cannot be provided, then these events should not be allowed to continue. Or are concerts held in other parts of York that will not intrude in the lives of York residents? Do we not matter to this council? My next point in Mr. Gallagher's submission I want to pick up is that he says the event was, quote, broadly compliant. Now, to me, you are either compliant or you're not. This seems a manipulative way of saying that it was not compliant, and that indeed, by his own submission, states it exceeded the limit at 2 locations. He then goes on to say that they undertook monitoring of complainants' properties, not mine for the record, and that noise would have been attenuated by 15 dB due to an open window. Firstly, this is an assumption because they didn't want it inside the property or outside, to my knowledge. And it also assumes that we would not want to be outside in the garden on a pleasant summer afternoon. An unreasonable assumption, don't you think? I would also like to touch on diversity and inclusivity, which isn't mentioned in the environmental report. 90% of autistic people suffer from some form of sensory hypersensitivity and react physically and mentally to loud stimuli. Now, we have an autistic child who was very badly affected by the continuous noise of this concert. He showed his fear of the noise with extreme avoidance of the situation and heightened agitation. He has difficulty communicating, and we observed real signs of distress over the changes in the times of the concert. His discomfort definitely increased as the noise increased. It was a very hard weekend for all of us. Now, you may say that we live in a city and we should expect some noise, but we live in the green suburbs in an area close to the river to avoid such disturbing incidents. We should not be expected to tolerate such unreasonable levels of noise for such prolonged periods because the organisers say it is simply too difficult to install noise mitigation measures. If it is too hard to do, then, as I say earlier, they should not be permitted to hold these intrusive events and instead should follow a similar policy to that of Manchester Council, where they need to seek alternative venues away from residential properties. Expecting many thousands of residents to tolerate unreasonable levels of noise is not a suitable compromise. Before I conclude, I would just like to address the submission made by Councillor Mason, who made a statement on behalf of the Liberal Democrats. Previous advice that I have been given when speaking to councillors is that they should remain impartial and have an open mind before any debate about an issue. And it's very disappointing that they seem to be ignoring their own advice. And I would urge the committee to discount his submission. I believe his position as a member responsible for the economy may also create a conflict of interest too. To sum up, I'm not saying that such events should not be allowed to continue, but there needs to be consideration for local residents and they should be given equal consideration. Discounting mitigation measures simply because they are too hard, too impractical or too expensive is not a satisfactory compromise. Residential immunity should not be sacrificed just because such events bring trade to the city. So, thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Mr. Dickinson? So I'll offer to Michelle Hazelwood first.
No.
Okay, do you have any questions? No? So subcommittee, yeah, Councillor Cobain.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Dickinson. Can I just a couple of questions? You say that there were several residents complained about the event on the night.
Yeah.
Can you give us, do you know how many?
I followed it up with the phone call to the council. He did say there were several others.
Okay.
At the time, but I don't have the exact numbers to hand. But that's obviously on top of those that made submissions to the licence review as well. They may have been the same, I don't know.
Okay, all right, thanks. And you said in your statement that you didn't know who you could complain to?
I would complain to the environmental protection. I think it's like the noise hotline the council have, but really they only start from I think 5 o'clock. And the response was there's very little they could do. It's an organised event, you know, not our hands are tied effectively.
Did you have was there a number advertised anywhere for the person that was in charge of the event?
There may have been, but I wasn't aware of it. I didn't have sight of it.
All right, okay, thanks. You made a really interesting point about low frequency noise, because obviously that travels sort of further, doesn't it? Those sort of baselines, etc. What's are you saying that there isn't an appropriate decibel level for that, or?
I'm far from an expert on this. It's quite an art in itself, from what I understand. But if you listen to music, you can generally hear the low frequency bass beat that will carry further. So if you have an event in Museum Gardens, most of the noise will probably be naturally attenuated as you move further away. But that low frequency bass beat, that can travel some distance. And that's the point, that you have noise measuring around the site, but you don't measure further away from the site unless somebody complains, understand. But then when you do go further away, you're just taking an arbitrary dB value. It's whatever dB it is.
Sure.
But that doesn't recognise that, yes, it may appear quiet on a noise monitor, meter, whatever, but that low frequency bass beat causes probably a level of annoyance that isn't recognised, even though the sound level may seem low. And the Noise Council have produced a document sort of highlighting that, where just an arbitrary dB value, whatever that is, doesn't recognise that annoying, irritating, constant bass beat for, in this case, over 6 hours, when you may want to be outside, windows open.
Okay, sorry, the Noise Council, you'll have to excuse my ignorance. What's the Noise Council?
It was a surprise to me. I didn't realise there was a Noise Council, but I did a little bit of research. Yes, there is a council, the Noise Council, and they produce all sorts of guidance documents, recommendations that local authorities and such like can use that here too.
Okay, thanks. And just the just the last one. Oh no, a couple more. Just for clarification, really. In your submission, you're saying that the 65 dBA threshold is too high. I mean, obviously, we're not experts in this, but what are you suggesting it should be?
Well, the 65 dB is what was made in the submission, so that's the threshold level.
Yeah.
That doesn't really much to me. All I know is that that level was broadly adhered to, but it still caused great annoyance, inconvenience for a whole weekend, for me, for several other people who made complaints, for several other people who made supporting statements for this review. So clearly, whatever 65 dB means, that isn't a suitable threshold level.
Okay, thanks. And just one final question, just to get in my head where you're at. I don't want to know your address.
Yes.
But when you said you lived sort of in the suburbs, what part of the city are you based in?
Clifton Green, so it's on Westminster Road. It's the address is in the application anyway. It's on Westminster Road.
Great. Thank you.
Any questions, Councillor Baxter?
Similar to Councillor Kilbane's question, in terms of what do you think would be more reasonable for the residents in terms of not just the sort of decibels, but other sort of options that the council could do to bring the sort of noise down?
There's, I mean, as I say, I'm not an expert on it, but I understand there are various noise suppression mitigation devices you can use. So you can put sound barriers around the site. You could use directional speakers. You could have monitoring further afield. You could have a way of asking the sound engineers to turn the volume down. You can do various checks beforehand to make sure it's not going to exceed these levels again. There's all sorts of things that can be done, that are done in other areas to reduce the noise down. It's quite common to have outdoor events, as I say, Manchester, London, other cities have these things. There's, as I say, sound barriers, noise doors. So there's a lot that can be done to bring the noise down. As I say, I don't want to stop these events happening. It clearly is good for the city centre, but there needs to be recognition that we can't just blast out loud noise because, oh, well, it's too difficult, too expensive to put some noise suppression in place. And, you know, to heck with the residents, they're just going to have to put up with it. That isn't an acceptable compromise.
I have just one question, if that's okay. I just wanted to ask if you were aware in advance that this event was going to take place. Were you one of the people who were leafleted, or do you live further away so you weren't aware of it?
I wasn't aware of it. No, I may have been leafleted. There's lots of leaflets come through for all sorts of things, but I wasn't aware of it. No.
Okay, so it was when it happened.
When it happened, it was a surprise.
It was first a surprise to you. Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay. Thank you for that. So we will now move on to the licence holders case. So Michelle Hazelwood, I'd like to invite you to make your case.
I can do. Usually it's the responsible authorities who put
Okay.
things forward first as a.
We do it the other way around.
I'm happy to back whichever way.
Yeah, anyway.
So, okay. Yeah, okay, then we will have the Public Protection Officer's case. Michael Golightly.
Hello, yeah, it's Michael Glidley from City York Council Environmental Protection Unit. Museum gardens have been granted a premises licence, which includes the ability to have events which by definition meet the regulated entertainment, such as outdoor live music and recorded music. In order to help manage the noise, conditions were put on the premises licence, including to have a noise management plan. This was completed by a noise consultant, a professional noise consultant, and was submitted as part of the premises licence application. The noise management plan limits the number of larger events outdoors to 6 days per year. So this isn't 6 events per year, this is just 6 days per year. Then further restricts the louder levels, such as this concert, these kind of levels of 65 dB, to only 3 events per year. So that it's very, very restricted in the amount of events that can actually happen. So it's only 3 days per year. The rest have to be run at 15 dB above background, which is very, very stringent. At the locations around the site, the background monitoring was carried out prior to the events taking place. The levels that were observed there would have been equivalent to 65 dB as a limit anyway. That would be about the background. So if you were 15 dB above 45, 50 dB, above 50 dB, it would be 65 dB anyway. So it's relevant to the environment. That background level is based on an L90, which is exceeded for 90% of the time. That is lower than the average ambient noise that you would experience around the city, which would be higher again. So it's just to put that into perspective for you. The plan includes monitoring the events and controlling events during the actual events themselves and having a post review afterwards. So if there are any problems encountered, these can be dealt with for any future events. This is the first one to take place here, and the applicants had professional noise consultants as part of the noise management plan actually doing monitoring around the site. So they monitored at 4 specific locations around the site, but also did roaming monitoring to try and understand the environment of that area. These noise consultants would then relay any issues that they saw to the sound engineers. So if they were approaching the limits which had been set, or if they exceeded the limits which were set, they would then ask the sound engineers to reduce these down again. They did that, and when we say broadly compliant, on the first day and the second day, up to around about 8:30, 9 o'clock at night, it was compliant. Then you had some breaches. However, on the third day, it was completely compliant. So the whole day they were complying with the limits, which demonstrates that the noise monitoring they were doing was working. There were some breaches in 2 locations just around the site, but these were very, very marginal. To put it into perspective, that was 2 dB increase in sound. Now, the way the human ear works is that unless you get a 3 dB increase of sound either way, you cannot perceive the difference in sound. So if it's 65 dB, it sounds like 65 dB. At 66 dB, it sounds like 65 dB. At 67 dB, it still sounds like 65 dB. You don't hear that change until it becomes 68 dB or above. What this means is that, in practical terms, we wouldn't be looking at a breach of the license or a breach of those limits until it had been humanly plausible to hear that difference. Therefore, we didn't feel that it was a breach of the license conditions, and we didn't feel that it met the threshold for being a public nuisance. 4 complaints were received during the event. On the first night, there were no complaints. On the last day, there was no complaints, and there was only 4 on the second day. 2 of those were on the Westminster Road. Monitoring was carried out there as a consequence to this, and the levels were found to be 45 dB, inclusive of the music. Again, that is 20 dB below the threshold limit that was given for the premises license. That's 20 dB below the limit of 65 dB. Meant that it wasn't a breach of the license. Was very, very unlikely to be a statutory nuisance, especially with the short duration of these events, as in only 3 days per year. And we didn't, again, feel that this was relevant to be a public nuisance. The sound, if you extrapolate that from outside to inside the house, if you use a standard acoustic assumption of 15 dB reduction through a window, through an open window, the sound inside the house would be below the threshold that's set by the World Health Organization for acceptable levels inside a house, and below the national guidance on the BS 8233, which is to deal with the sound insulation of premises. So it would be very, very low indeed. Also, I am aware of the fact that they were monitoring around the site, and they were also looking at the different frequency levels. I know that's been raised here today, but the low frequencies were being monitored. At one point, it was too loud, and so they tweaked that down as well, because they've got the ability to do that. So they did take that into consideration. At these levels, it would be very, very unlikely to be a statutory nuisance, and it's in line with all guidance. Now, the limit of 65 dB, which has been set, is in line with local guidance that we've set out, which limits any outdoor events to 3 days would be set at 65 dB. Then after that, there'd be 15 dB above background. So any events beyond the 3 days would have to be very stringently at 15 dB above background, but only 3 days for the louder events. Bearing in mind that at this location, the 15 dB would be approximately 65 dB anyway. It's also in line with the Noise Council's guidance. The Noise Council there were a set of professionals who deal with noise issues, and what they did is they came up with some limits. Now, they're not really arbitrary limits. There are limits that they've set, which again says 65 dB would be the overall sound limit that you'd have for 3 days. So this event has been run in conjunction with our local guidance, the national guidance, has demonstrated noise levels which, when monitored, were 20 dB below the threshold limit given. And very, very low and in line with all other guidance that we'd have in the country for controlling noise. Basically, in summary, we feel that the conditions on the premises licence are robust, achievable and enforceable and are adequate for controlling the noise of this type of event, especially when you consider it's only on for 3 days of the year as opposed to 352 days of the year. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to invite any questions for Michael Golightly, and I'll offer that to the applicant, Andrew Dickinson, first. Do you have any questions?
Not so much a question, just a few points to clarify. I mean, you say it's only 3 days a year, bearing in mind that's 3 days during the summer period. It's 3 days starting from early afternoon until 10:30 in the evening. So it is very disruptive for those 3 days. It's not as if it's sort of during the winter when you may have sort of windows closed and so on. It does have a huge impact on those 3 days. And you do say, I think you mentioned it attenuated, as I mentioned before, your assessment assumes that you would be inside and not outside, because you say the 15 dB from open windows. And the last point, I don't think there's really adequate consideration about the low frequency noises, because as you said in your submission, you've just taken that sort of dB reading outside somebody's property. You don't look at that low frequency carrying some distance. It was looked at around the site maybe, but you didn't look at how that travels.
They did monitor it around the site, the low frequency. However, like I said, they did take out, they identified there was a low frequency issue at one point, so they took that out. And that's all I can say about that, really.
But just to clarify, that was at the site, not assessing how that low frequency travels to faraway properties.
Probably so.
Thank you. Any questions from Michelle? No. Okay. Any questions from the committee? Councillor Kilbane.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Michael. You completely lost me at the beginning with
Sorry,
the 45 dBA and background noise, and so I mean, so what? And I think you might have clarified it a little bit later on. Are you saying that the background noise in the city centre is generally around 45 dB?
45 to 50 dB, yes, correct.
Is that the same?
That's the L90. That's the background noise levels. It's which is there for 90% of the time. That's a lower level. It actually would be louder if you have the all-encompassing sound of the LEAQ. There's two different figures. There's the L90, which is the sound pressure which is experienced for 90% of the time. Okay. And then the all-encompassing sound, which is a different figure, which is actually normally louder. So it would be likely to be louder than
what's the difference between the two? What's the all-encompassing versus the 90%?
When you're trying to control the noise of another source that's impacting and going to add to the average LEAQ, yeah, then you use the lower threshold. Okay. Therefore, because if you add noise acts logarithmically, so as you increase another source to another source, it can be increased by 3 dB. So then you'd have a creep in the noise, which then might affect people more. So what you try to do is keep that below that level so you don't get the creep, so that you're controlling the level.
Okay. Okay. So the 65 dBA that's set for the 3 days of the year is actually, the other 3 days are also going to be around about 65 dBA as well, because it's you're around 15 above. Okay, right, okay. And what's the background noise likely to be out in more suburban settings?
I mean, if you look at the monitoring we took there with about 45 dB, that was inclusive of the noise. So it's difficult to say, but that is difficult to say.
Okay. Okay. On the question of the low level frequencies, did you say that something was done to try and control that?
Yes, one of the noise consultants who was there on the day had identified a problem with, I think it was around about the 135 frequency hertz, which is predominantly you get that with music. And then so he tweaked down those levels so they can reduce that. I know in the noise management plan they were concerned about that and had already addressed it. And then they further addressed it on the day by reducing that further. So they were aware of it.
Okay. Okay. I think that's it for me.
Councillor Baxter.
Thank you, Chair. So in the additional documents that we got about the proposed condition, I was just wondering if you could go into a bit more detail about why, what information sort of came to you that you thought that the condition was sort of unreasonable.
Yeah, basically, noise limiting devices work very well inside a premises because you can control that environment. Whereas when you're outside, you get erroneous noises such as airplanes travelling over or ambulances coming past. There was a bell mentioned at one point in here which raised the level slightly for that minute. And then that can then cut out the entire system. So, you know, it can unduly cut the entire system so they can't control it in that way. And that's the problem with it, really.
Okay, thank you. A couple of questions from me. I just wondered, did we measure the background noise on Westminster Road or as far out as that? How far did we measure background noise to?
No, you'd only do around the south, and they only do around the south, around the site. So it was measured around the site, not further away.
So when we said that the noise on Westminster Road was 45 decibels on the night itself,
yes,
we don't know what the background is for Westminster Road.
No, we don't. We know that it was 20 dB below the threshold set, but we don't know what the background levels were there.
Yeah. And what is the World Health Organization threshold? You mentioned that. Is that indoors or is there an outdoor threshold?
They do have an outdoor threshold. I mean, normally some of the levels I'd have to try to remember it now, but it's somewhere around about 50 dB, 55 dB outside, and inside. I'd have to double check that one, I think.
Yeah.
But inside it is 30 dB. So if you were to extrapolate that 45 dB, so it's 35 dB inside during the daytime. That's why it was lower. So 45 going in through minus 15, you get to 30, and therefore it was below the 35 limit during the daytime for the World Health Organization's inside.
With the windows closed?
With the windows open.
With the windows open, okay, right. And how do the conditions imposed on the events at Museum Gardens compare to those, say, at the racecourse, just so I can get a bit of a comparison for York?
Yeah, we've imposed exactly the same conditions there as well. So for the Knavesmire, the racecourse, we have 3 events per year which can run at 65 dB, 15-minute average, and then you have the rest of which are 15 dB but above background. We've done that there because obviously they're surrounded by residential purposes there which are directly affected. We found that's very, very useful there, so it's in line with that. And if we do get single day events somewhere which we are concerned about, again we put in this 65 dB limit.
Okay. And I'm also just interested in some of the mitigations that have been suggested by the applicant and that you've sort of looked into. So the applicant suggested, I think, noise limiters, directional speakers, sound barriers, and then talked about Manchester and what they do there. So I just wondered if you could give me any information about those types of mitigation, whether they'd be appropriate here, what difference they would make.
Okay, the noise limiting device, as I've said, it's just unfortunate it's not going to work outdoors, which is just shit. I mean, you could put it there, but it'll be so overrun or something to try and make it work. It might make it not work because of the outside noise. The noise barriers potentially is worth looking into. That's a good point. That might help. I know that the premises organisation, the license holders are on about potentially reorientating the stage as well, so that would take it hopefully away from the flats opposite and also Westminster Road. So that again is something else they can do in that for directivity. The other mitigation that was proposed was
the directional speakers. Is that what you were just saying?
Yeah, they already do have directed speakers, so they put the array up high and they angle them down towards the customers. Therefore, they absorb the sound and it stops the sound spilling out. So they're already doing that. But yet, by re-angling the stage, again, they could reorientate the stage to try and make it less directional towards where the other residents are in the city. I know they are talking about doing that for next year, which might help. And then the noise limit, setting the noise limits any further, really, it's already kind of about it's around about the right level, really, for the location.
So what about in Manchester? Is that equivalent, or what happened? Do you know anything about? You don't know that. Okay. And my other question was, in terms of the information that was, I mean, possibly this isn't a question for you, but the information that goes out beforehand, what condition did we give about who should be leafleted, how far the leaflets should go, how much in advance?
Again, not entirely sure. I mean, you'd kind of look at the near vicinity in the first instance. This is the first year, so you can find out where, you know, where to leaflet for next year, for example, and that's in the noise management plan anyway. So I think that's worth, you know, sending out a little bit further next year. However, no, not really.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so now I'd like to invite the licence holder to present your case. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody, Chair.
Thank you very much for giving us that little bit of extra time. We have submitted written documentation, so written submission, because we know we're time critical, so we need to address the really key things, but there's a lot of other information in that bundle and the written submission. We have, because my clients take this very, very seriously indeed, the CEO of the trust with us today, Catherine, who is over in the corner. We also have Rachel from Future Sounds, who were the primary promoters, and Richard Hurd, who's head of, and then on Zoom, and perhaps most importantly of all this, we have the acoustician who prepared the reports, noise management plan, worked very closely with your EP department and licensing, and then did the noise management report afterwards, and will have been involved in the post-SAG Security Advisory Group meeting, and understands noise. And so what I'm proposing to do is a little preamble explanation, then call Gareth Hants in, because he's on Zoom. He can give you a proper explanation, like Mr. Golan, of noise, which I will not be able to do, and then come back to myself to go through some of the more legal aspects in relation to licensing acts and guidance, etc. So if you're okay with that, we'll get cracking. So this was an inaugural event, which was undertaken by the Watch Museums Trust in the museum's garden. It was for 3 days. First night, Jack Savaretti, and then 2 nights of Shed 7, which coincided with 30 years in the music industry and a homecoming event. So an absolutely wonderful opportunity. My clients, just to make it clear, have been approached many, many times by promoters saying we would really like to use the museum gardens for events. And we can't go on. Right. And in the past, because of their sensitivity, their historical significance, they'd never felt that the promoter and the offer was right. When Future Sounds came forward, they knew they'd worked in venues which were equally historic, archaeological sites, etc., and they'd executed the position very well. They knew they were also linked into very, very experienced contractors such as Electric Star, and that they could then be confident that they could execute such an event well. And throughout, their primary objective was to operate as a charity at best practice, upholding their position of responsibility, which they sit within the City of York, looking after some of your most cherished possessions, museum gardens being one of them. But their customers are the residents. They work with the residents, they live cheek and jowl with them, and they knew that they had to look after the residents and support the licensing objective of prevention of public nuisance. And a huge amount of work went into making sure that that could be achieved even on this inaugural event. So within the documentation we've submitted, there's some photos of museum gardens. I suspect you're very familiar with them. Then a plan setting out how things were set out. Thereafter, there's a schedule of the dates when interaction took place, and that is the top of the iceberg. So the very important meetings with the Security Advisory Group, with environmental health, with licensing, and then their endeavours to make sure that those persons in the immediate community were aware of the event and to give them an opportunity to give feedback about their reservations and concerns which might arise from the event taking place. And you can see that there was a huge amount of consultation. Leaflet was sent out on the last consultation offer, and that went to 1,500 residential addresses because they knew they lived in a residential hinterland. And then running in line with that, they then put into place significant time and effort to look at background noise levels And Gareth Hance from Electric Star can explain that more to you. But in the bundle, you've got the extracts from the BSA report. And what I would say of importance is on those figures is that you can see that the lowest background noise that they were recording was 44 decibels. But if you went over towards Leonard Mews and the more busy parts of the city, it went up to 61. So they're very much in the bottom end of all the criteria of adding 15 to decibel readings. They were never seeking to exceed or push this event into a situation where problems could arise. There was a bigger document than the noise management plan regarding risk assessment for the whole operation of the event. You'll have flicked through, read through the representations against and in support. You will note that there is no adverse comment about how the event operated on site. There is no crime and disorder, and you have no representation from North York's police. It was executed with absolute clarity and very well undertaken indeed. Plenty of stewards, plenty of staff. So really the only issue is in connection with the noise and how the noise was set up in the first place and then subsequently managed during the course of the event. And what I'd like to do now is invite Gareth to come through Zoom, and he's going to give you a little bit of a resume about the steps that they did and how they worked with environmental protection. I'm hoping he'll address the issue of low frequency if he's been listening in, and then what they altered and how they were able to do that on the night. So hopefully we should have Gareth on Zoom and able to come into the meeting.
Good morning. Thank you, Chair. I hope you can hear me. Yeah, so I don't want to repeat what's already been gone through. I think Michael Golightly covered the topics very well. So the highlights are that we had a proactive management plan in place. The exceedances were relatively insignificant. Where exceedance did occur, there was immediate remedial action taken. There was quite a lot of uncertainty about external factors that we can't control, wind, traffic, there were boats with music systems. And finally, the community engagement was positive throughout. So just breaking that down very quickly, conscious of time. So the sound management plan, it adopted all the current best practice. We looked at the context of the local area. We looked at the background noise levels, and we compared it to the POP code, the Noise Council's code of conduct, which is colloquially known as the POP code. That's actually now been withdrawn, and a new version is being worked on at the moment. But which includes things like the low frequency advice, which needs revision. But nonetheless, the sound management plan we produced was best practice and did consider local context. We found that the local collaboration with environmental protection and licensing was excellent throughout. There was no point where any of our plans were not discussed transparently with local authority. And again, it comes back to context of the venue and the community. All of these things were adequately considered. On site, once we got on site, so we have a sound meter on front of house so that the sound engineer could see the level. Simultaneously, we had a team of people going around both the perimeter and on site, measuring the noise levels. And at no point did we find that the levels were clearly excessive. And I'm be careful here because, yes, there were times when we measured 67, 60, 66 and 67. But, as previously discussed, this is within the margin for uncertainty. At the time of those measurements, there was music coming from boats, there was traffic, there was kids playing. There's lots of reasons why that 66, 67 may not be music. And in fact, if you look at DEFRA's report on traffic noise in York, it predicts that the noise level on those roads around the museum are as high as 70 dB. So we cannot be certain that 66, 67 was indeed music. During the sound checks, that's our opportunity to make sure that we get the levels right for the concert. So yes, there were times during the sound checks where we observed a level of 68 dBA, but that's our opportunity to put the controls in right so that it doesn't occur during the concert, and that is what we did. The level of 65 as a control value, by the way, in context, is actually relatively low. If you look at Manchester and about 25 other venues that I've worked at, we're dealing with a level of 75A dBA as a limit. So this venue is in fact 10 dB lower than a lot of similar venues. 10 dB is perceived as being half as loud. And in fact, on that note, when we consider Westminster Road at 45 dBA, that's 4 times lower than the permissible level. So the exceedances were minor, and they're also uncertain. We're not sure that it was in fact music, and they are also considerably lower than similar venues. Nonetheless, we weren't relaxed about this. We took prompt action. We continually were talking to the sound engineer about making those adjustments as necessary. We didn't simply say, look, it's below 65, carry on. We were continually making sure that these levels were at the lowest viable levels for a concert. And in fact, on that note, we talk about the Manchester report, it cites the pop code that says that a level under 695 dBA in the audience is unviable. In fact, we were running about 90 dBA in the audience. So we're 5 dB below what is considered a viable level. In terms of those specific considerations about low frequencies, that was included in our assessment. We use a thing called DBC, which considers low frequency advice. There's also, again, coming back to the Noise Council advice, where it discusses that if you control the dBA value, the 65 dBA, then the low frequency is adequately controlled. But not satisfied with that blanket statement, we also measure the low frequencies, and we can confirm that the low frequencies were indeed significantly below an actionable level when you look at this context and similar venues. So I won't take any of your time. Thank you. If you've got any questions, don't hesitate. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. I hope that's clarified on top of what Go Lightly said. So it's now down to me to make the formal submissions. My first and preliminary submission is the quite broad ones. You have a very limited representation from environmental protection. Indeed, it is one of more providing clarity than criticism. And there's no representation from any other responsible authorities, be that licensing, who my clients work very closely with, or the police. There are a number of representations which have been received in support of the premises licence holder. Yes, people who attended the event, but also people who lived in the vicinity. And the outroar, which is very often associated when events go wrong, is not present in the papers before you or in the public domain, which has come out since publication that the review is taking place. And that is of significant importance because this event did take place in the middle of York, surrounded by people who are educated and articulate and have a view about how they see their city being run. Additionally, I would like to go back to the initial documentation produced by Mr. Dickinson in serving his review. It does not stipulate in there in any detail the loss of amenity which he experienced. He talks about the residents as a general body. In his verbal submissions to you today, he's talked about the low frequency and the noise levels. But as we go through the evidence, and you've heard from your environmental protection officer and also from our expert at Electric Star, there is very little evidence that the noise levels experienced by Mr. Dickinson at his own premises were over and above background noise levels. Within the documentation we've submitted, there is a snapshot of background noise levels from within the city itself. And Marygate, which is a reasonably occupied road with a certain level of traffic, but most definitely not the city centre, is coming in at 45 decibels. Equally, when Gareth and his team did the noise modelling, and in your bundle there's a document J with a green plan, and next to it, you will see that they tried to gauge the potential spread of the noise. Mr. Dickinson's premises is beyond the edge of this plan. And therefore, on the modelling, which they then relied on for the leafleting and communication, he was outside the scope of anticipated potential impact. When the complaint was received on the Friday, on the Friday, they then went and did monitoring directly on the road to verify if their modelling was correct. And within the report document, which you also have in the bundle, there is annotated Westminster Road, and it's at 45 decibels. Now, it is possible that the background noise of that area may be 40, but as we've already heard, there's this margin of error of 3 decibels, and to actually perceive a change in noise levels, you need to be pushing a lot more than that, very much in layman's terms, to have impact. So the actual initiating document of this review does not really go to the loss of amenity, does not go to the licensing objective of public nuisance. And that takes me then to the more technical arguments which we put forward in our documentation, and the concept of public nuisance. And the licensing objectives have been crafted very carefully when the Licensing Act was brought forward in 2003. It is not just prevention of nuisance, it is prevention of public nuisance. And I've set out in the documentation the learned information from the House of Lords as to when something could be a public nuisance and the requirement for our class of persons to be impacted. In this instance, we have 3 persons who have written in support of the review expressing concern. One, I would suggest Mr. Dickinson does not hold evidence of nuisance in any event, and the other 2 are in locations where monitoring was undertaken and are quite disparate. So their geographical spread is such that I think it would be very hard to say they form a class, and whether a class could be 2 or 3 people. So our first argument is that the licensed objective of public nuisance has not actually been triggered. You may say we want to look after all our residents, whether they're a class or not, each person is important, and we understand that. Therefore, we must then look at the definition of nuisance. And as Mr. Golightly has already said to you, in his learned, experienced opinion, this was not a matter which triggered a statutory nuisance, because the thresholds set out in various different forms by persons who understand noise way more than I do, believe that the threshold of 65 and the movement of up to 61, 66, 67 would not create a statutory nuisance. And I think what I must say to you is that that is very important, what Mr. Golightly says, because he is duty bound as an environmental protection officer under the Environmental Protection Act, that he observes a public nuisance, statutory nuisance, then he has to enforce and use his powers under the EPA for things like noise abatement notices. There is no enforcement action being taken in relation to the event in July. And of significance as well is that the Museum Gardens hosts other events, which, as Mr. Golightly has explained to you, very often run to this 60-65 decibel level, as they are permitted to do due to the level of background noise in the immediate vicinity, this 45 plus 15 equation, or 50 plus 15. So we have York Proms, no complaints, no issues. We have the Mystery Play cycle, no complaints, no issues. We have fireworks after those events, no complaints, no issues. And those fireworks will have come in way, way, way beyond 65 decibels when we're just talking purely about noise. So this is a site which is run very tightly. They understand their constraints, and they bring in the most professional people who they can rely on to execute those levels, maintain the noise management plan,
and then not recklessly just carry on during the course of the night because the noise management plan's being signed off. Do the monitoring, do the reporting, do the tweaking when little fluctuations occur, which could be simply nothing to do with the band playing, but the wind direction slightly altering and taking the sound quicker, faster in a different way before it gently dissipates. But they were across the piece continually monitoring, tweaking, and trying to keep on those figures, which from the report figures, which we've extrapolated in the documentation, is visible and undertaken. Then moving on to the licensing condition, we would suggest that even if there was a technical condition, there has been no loss of amenity. And that is what licensing objectives are there for, to maintain the amenity of the residents. And thus, to take a significant step in relation to this licence or alter things which have worked so well would be a disproportionate and inappropriate step. However, my clients, they're here today, they take this very seriously. They are not complacent at all. If the licenses continue to go forward on the same terms, they will work with the EP department, they will work with their advisors. They're already thinking about things they can change. And I've set that out in the documentation towards that, learnings as to how they can move forward. There's already a discussion about the stage. The stage came on the back of a vehicle, plopped down. If they build the stage, taking into account the topography, they can slightly reorientate it and send the direction of noise towards the higher background noise receptors. So then we mitigate the output of the overall level. The highways point, I must submit, is not for licensing, but there's learnings to be achieved from that. And we would suggest that in the final informational leaflets, we give an indication of when roads may be closed. But the big thing and the important thing is the collaborative approach, which my clients have undertaken during this process to bring this inaugural event to York City Centre, working with those people who know and understand noise, and then keeping on top of that with that collaborative approach during the whole of the event to minimise the risk of public nuisance, which we do not think occurred. I think I'm at the door.
Thank you. Okay, so I'd like to invite any questions. Andrew Dickinson, do you have any questions?
Just to get a few sort of points of clarity, you say, well, firstly, you say that I hadn't demonstrated that I suffered a loss of amenity. Well, I can tell you, I certainly did suffer a loss of amenity. It went on for several hours over 2 nights. I don't know what more I can do to convince you that I suffered a loss of amenity. You make the comparison with fireworks. I think that's a bit unfair because fireworks are short in duration. It's a short burst and then it's over. This was over 6 hours. So that comparison isn't fair at all. There's been various talks of comparisons with background noise. It's not a fair comparison. You can't compare the noise in the city centre and say, well, it's whatever dB it is, so it's all fine, because outlying areas such as Westminster Road are far lower. The background noise level is far, far lower. So that is not a fair comparison. And the consultation, you say it was robust and so on, I would suggest it was slightly inadequate because it didn't cover up to Westminster Road. And as I've said before, these very low frequencies do carry a very considerable distance, and there doesn't seem to have been any recognition of that.
Thank you.
So I'll let you respond.
Okay.
I think the only answer, I think, the question is, have you got your microphone on, else?
It's just, my voice is so loud, I usually do. Yes, the road was not leafleted, but that was based on a scientific assessment as to how far the noise may spread and those persons who potentially could have been impacted. Going forward, as part of the learnings, my clients can look at where other concerns were raised, looking at the representations came in. They can redesign the leafleting, the area. And that's not a problem, but it wasn't that they disregarded Mr. Dickinson or his residents on his road. They looked to see if there was any scientific evidence to support
but they may have been impacted by the event.
Thank you. Michael Golightly, do you have any questions? Okay. Committee, have you got any questions? Councillor Kilbane.
Thanks, Chair. Thanks, Michelle. Just do you know where your clients advertised the contact details for the designated premises supervisor?
Right, so they were on the documentation, the letters sent out. They're also on the website. And do you know anywhere else where it was advertised? There is a contact number on the website for the trust, isn't there, and a helpline?
In relation to this event, the person that was responsible for this event, the person that residents would contact if they had an issue with the event, where were residents expected to find that information? Sorry, so residents such as the applicant who might not have been leafleted.
All right, so there is contact details on the YMT website, Yorkshire Museums Trust.
Yeah, it's just, it is a condition of the licence that,
Yeah.
that person is contactable.
Yeah. And I think in support of that, that calls were received about different things during the course of the event.
Couple of questions for Gareth, if that's okay.
Yeah, hi.
Thanks. Hi. Just so that we're all clear on what this logarithmic scale of decibel measurement means, and checking my understanding. So when you say that the difference between 65 dBA and 45 dBA to a layperson, that's 20. Actually, in terms of your hearing, that means it's 4 times lower, did you say?
That's correct. In terms of perception, every 10 dB is perceived as being a doubling or halving.
Okay, so it goes down on that logarithmic scale, so it's quite dramatic in terms of the fall off of the sound as you lower the decibel levels. Can I just ask for clarification as well? You said that in Manchester these kind of events run at 75 dBA, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, Manchester's guidance is excellent. It draws on the withdrawn pop code, among other things. But yeah, there are plenty of events in Manchester that run at 75 dBA, which is, twice as loud.
So are you suggesting that actually the limit at Museum Gardens is too low?
I wouldn't say that, because I think that's a conversation that we would take on a case-by-case basis, and it's very contextual. But certainly, 65 dBA is the equivalent of a dishwasher or an air conditioning unit. It's not that loud.
Okay, thanks.
Councillor Baxter.
Thank you, Chair. I've found the last leaflet where it's got the contact, the phone number on here and the emails. I was just wondering if you could go in, if you know the detail of what correspondence you did have during that time and whether that did inform any of the decisions, or was it more the sound technicians that you had on the site that were sort of recording then?
I believe it was a combination of the two. I have people who were, Rachel, are you more able to answer that?
So has
Sorry, it's being broadcast live, so you won't be picked up unless you
sit down. The chair at the end with the microphone. Hi, Rachel from Future Sound. Regarding the residents hotline, as we call it in the event world, we had an email which was on the last residential letter, and that would come direct to me. And then we had a hotline number which went directly during the event days, went directly to the event control room that we had, where the North Yorkshire Police would sit in there, and Michael would have contact with, and anybody from like a services point of view would have access in that control room.
And did you get any calls in on the hotline?
Yes, there were calls. It's all logged on our event control log unit.
Sorry, just to follow up on that. And were any of those specifically about the noise and the levels of noise?
So we did have a few, I think. I believe Mr. Dickinson called into there, and we acted upon that. And there was one other on Marygate, I believe. I would have to refer back to it, but there were maybe 4 calls that came into the event control room, and then the event control would pass that on to Michael and Gareth's team, and they would go out and do the recordings.
And then subsequent tweaking to make sure those,
Yes,
those concerns were addressed.
As everything's been referenced in the documentation, that's when they acted upon it.
Thank you. Just a few questions from me. We've been talking a little bit about mitigations that could possibly improve the event, any future events, and you've mentioned about re-angling the stage, so that's presumably a possibility. We also mentioned sound barriers, and I just wondered if you had thought about that and if that's something that you think would make a difference and is a possibility. So yeah, if you could just...
Gareth, can you talk about sound barriers, please?
Yeah, sure. Sound barriers will have some benefit to some people, is the simple answer. Obviously, it would be much harder to try and use that to protect someone like Westgate Apartments, because you would need a barrier the size of Westgate Apartments, which is just not practical. But we certainly, those close receptors at ground level, there's something that you could do to help with those. Hope that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah, and then the decision on where to leaflet beforehand, was that done purely, you did the modelling on where the loudest sort of sound was expected to reach, and then you leafleted those people, or what radius did you leaflet and how did you decide where to leaflet?
So the modelling tries to determine where the dB will drop. And once the dB drops into general background noise levels, so this 40, 45 to 50, which they ascertained from the earlier testing, they then decided that the noise would not punch through, this is my language, this is not technical language, but won't punch through the background. So yes, you might have caught the odd little bit, but it would not become overriding what you're hearing generally in your day-to-day existence. So it loses its intrusiveness, it loses any potential impact on amenity. Whether that's noise nuisance or not, but it's gone down to that level where it's not punching through what's happening generally around you.
So just with that assumption about what is background noise, it seems that we're making an assumption that background noise is around 45 to 50 decibels, but there obviously are some areas of York that are less noisy than others. So I'm just wondering, when you did the modelling and then leafleted people, I mean, some of those suburban areas have presumably much lower levels of background noise, and so to determine whether the concert was going to be above their background, was that also taken into account, or were you just taking 45 as blanket background for York?
Gareth, can you give a little bit more detail in relation to the modelling and your expectations of background noise levels in more as you become increasingly suburban?
Yeah, sure. So I think, as you say, that the modelling, the framing of the model in the sound management plan is based on the cutoff where the predicted music noise level falls to around the prevailing sound level or lower. We do in fact model out as far as, I think, on York, off the mail, I think it was about 1 kilometre out. It might even be 2 kilometres out, which would include Westminster Road. But that's just the music level is below a measurable level that far out, which is why it's not presented in the sound management plan. In terms of background noise level, you actually arrive at a single value, because what is impractical is to is to take a background sound level road by road, or in fact door by door, and decide, oh, that's my music level at this house, and then next door it's something else, and down the street it's something else again. We don't do that. We tend to agree what is a representative value across the entire area. So it wouldn't really matter in this context if the level at Westminster Road is sufficiently lower. That said, looking at the noise modelling conducted by DEFRA, it really isn't that different to other parts of York. I hope that answers your question.
Okay, thank you.
If I could just add an addendum to our answer. My clients want to work with the residents of York. As I say, they value their position, they are a charity, they take their responsibility very seriously. If it would be better to go with the leafleting slightly further, then that is not something that they would object to. They don't have a problem doing that. And this was the inaugural event, and there are learnings to be gained from it. And they can be built into the noise management plan for the next future event, hopefully of this nature, and other events undertaken by the museum.
Thank you. That was going to be my next question about whether the leafleting could be altered. So that's good to hear. Then my other question was, when we talk about public nuisance, how much account is taken of people with protected characteristics? So the applicant mentioned that to an autistic person who might be hypersensitive to noise, that has a very different impact. And so how much attention was taken in terms of when you're doing your plan for, limiting the noise? Are you taking that into account?
So I think there's two parts to the answer. Public nuisance is defined at law. I would say it's quite old case law, and we have moved on as a society, understanding how people respond to different things and being much more understanding of different people's needs. So the case law is quite clear about a class of persons and looking very much on a broad overall basis at society. But second part of the answer is, and I don't know what the answer to this is, and I'm going to ask Gareth, if in the latest recommendations from the associations he's members of, who are leading the thought process on noise and acoustics, if there's been any developments in that area. Gareth, could you assist?
Yeah, much like the case law, there's no, it doesn't really consider neurodiversity or different sensitivities, but the noise level is considered not to cause a disturbance, and that would include all members of society. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. And then my last question is just, you mentioned wind direction. How much can the wind direction alter that distribution of sound? Obviously, we've got no control over the wind changing direction on the night. So how much is that taken into account, that your model shows a particular kind of outcome, but if the wind direction changes, it suddenly shifts the noise to places you perhaps weren't expecting? So how much do you build that into your controls?
Sorry.
Do you want to go first, Gareth? All I was going to say is, in your noise management plan, the weather forecast is built into it, and that's documented in the final version itself. But Gareth, over to you.
Yeah, so in practical situations, the sound level can vary by as much as 10 decibels in extreme weather conditions. Quite often the wind is the dominant noise source over the music. So, a swing of 10 decibels is what we experience in the field. In terms of the technical guidance, when we do the computer modelling, it adopts a standardised model for wind vector of a 2 decibel adjustment, and the noise model in the computer assumes everything is downwind all at the same time. Still an impossible situation, but in order to ensure that the noise map shows what the impact could be, everything is downwind.
Okay, thank you. That's really helpful. I think that's everything I wanted to ask. So we now get to the summing up part here. So I'm going to invite the applicant, Andrew Dickinson. You have 5 minutes if you want to do any summing up for us.
Yeah, I haven't planned anything, so apologies if it's a bit rough. I wasn't aware of given another opportunity, but just I could go through a few points really. Firstly, there's been talk of sort of noise monitoring around the city centre and saying that it's so many dBs and our event was so many dBs above that level. What's important to recognise is that Westminster Road and surrounding areas are far away from the city centre. So comparing it to city centre levels of noise is really quite relevant and misleading. And it may be who guidance and local guidance and so on and so forth say that whatever level of dB is acceptable. The fact remains that Westminster Road and surrounding streets are at a very quiet level, and we chose to live there precisely because of that. It is a quiet residential area surrounded by greenery and the river. We chose not to live next to a pub or a concert hall or whatever for those reasons, and I don't think that really has been recognised. And I think the monitoring and all of the modelling and so on compares it to city centre locations. The next point is that they have stringent conditions on 3 events, but not on another 3 events. So an obvious question would be, why can't the more stringent conditions be placed on all such events if it's practical to do so for 3 of them? There doesn't seem to have been any recognition, as I mentioned earlier, in these low frequency noises. We were taking sort of dB measurements, but as I've said earlier, it's that constant bass beat, that loud bass beat that travels far away, some distance, right outside all of your modelling and consultation map, and can affect residents many miles away. And that's really the gripe I have, because that was what was causing that real annoyance for many, many hours. It wasn't just a short burst like fireworks, it was for over 6 hours. And there doesn't seem to have been much or a little recognition of that fact. The point was made that my immunity hadn't been defined or clarified, or I'd said that my immunity wasn't affected. I can assure you it was. For 6 hours, two nights over a weekend, on a summer weekend when I would like to have been enjoying the outdoors, I was prevented from doing so and actually left my house and went elsewhere. So my immunity was certainly affected. It caused me to leave my property for the best part of a weekend. The scope of the monitoring, I would suggest, is simply inadequate. All that they are doing is monitoring the site, monitoring around the site, and not monitoring further afield, which would seem to be an obvious thing to do. It seems to have been an oversight for whatever reason. There's been talk of the Manchester and that they have higher limits or whatever. One point that they did have in their policy that I read, it was very clear that if you have outdoor events surrounded by residential properties, then that probably isn't a suitable area to hold such outdoor events. And it was very clear that they have to have adequate mitigation. It didn't define a dB that I saw. There was guidance levels provided, but it was very clear that you must consider where it is in relation to residential properties. So if it's in the middle of a field somewhere, you're going to be not affecting many people, whereas if it's the middle of York, it's quite different. And I think that's an important point that seems to have been overlooked. The phone call, yes, I did complain about the noise, but I certainly didn't observe any appreciable difference. It was logged and it was, yes, thank you, we'll take that, and nothing happened. It may be they've taken it, but if they did turn the noise down, it certainly didn't have any appreciable effect. I was advised to follow it up with a licence review, which is hence why we're here. There was talk about the background noise was only something like equivalent to a dishwasher or a washing machine. Well, again, you need to take that into consideration as to where you are when you hear that noise. So if you're in a quiet residential area, then the noise of something like a dishwasher or a washing machine trundling away for 6 hours maybe is an inconvenience. And also consider the frequency bands of that noise, not just an arbitrary dB level. And the final point, the guidance on autism, and from what I've read, there doesn't seem to be any recognition of that, unfortunately. So it seems to be that disabled people who are more affected by this noise, essentially it's just hard luck, you know, not interested, which is deeply regrettable. But I certainly couldn't find any formal policy document that recognised that. As you say, case law is quite dated, so it may not have caught up, but sadly there is no recognition of that I'm aware of. Yeah. Apologies, it was a bit mixed up there. I hadn't prepared for it. Nothing else to add.
Thank you. I'm now going to invite our Public Protection Officer, Michael Golightly, to do any sum up.
Firstly, just to say that we felt that the event was well planned, well monitored, well organised. The breaches were very, very marginal indeed, and would have resulted in a perceptible change in noise levels of people's properties. Robust conditions were in place on the premises licence and in the noise management plan. Professionals were on site at the time to monitor levels. They did do this. They did reduce levels where needed. There were 3 days of event. The 3rd day, there was no complaints received, and it was completely compliant. Therefore, they would below that level completely. And basically, we just believe that the conditions on the premises licence are robust, achievable, enforceable, and are adequate for controlling noise at these type of events in this location, especially since they're only reduced to 3 days a year.
Thank you. And now I'd like to invite the licence holder, Michelle Hazelwood.
Thank you. You've heard a lot from us today. You've heard a lot from us today. Just want to go back over some of the key principles and then a little bit about the Licensing Act and the guidance. So first of all, the charity takes its position very, very seriously. You have senior people here today. You've heard how they've engaged very, very experienced people who understand noise. They wanted to do this event, they wanted to do it well, best practice, and they executed at a level. They learned as they went along. They were prepared and willing to change and alter to make sure they achieved compliance and work with the authorities and reduce any potential adverse impact. And that is what licensing authorities, environmental protection officers want to see from anybody undertaking events of these magnitude in a residential area, that they can work forward, they understand the parameters which have been set down. And that takes me to the second point, parameters. You cannot have a situation where there are no parameters. There has to be a statutory framework, and there is a statutory framework around the Environmental Protection Act, the Licensing Act, and the thresholds which learned people who understand noise consider to be appropriate in the circumstances. And that is what we have here. We have compliance with the statutory framework. And unfortunately, sometimes for some people, that statutory framework will not be what they want it to be. But if we don't have a framework, we don't have the standards, we cannot just have a very loose scenario where somebody 5 miles away who doesn't like Shed 7 is entitled to say this event shouldn't occur. And that's the extreme example of the lack of statutory framework that I can give to you. Then looking at this premises itself, it has for many, many years executed excellent events without cause for complaint or concern. They do the proms, they do the mystery plays, they have forced tea pay, and lots of other wonderful cultural activities. They wanted to expand into a more contemporary offer and work very, very hard with the people you've heard speak to achieve that. They were not feckless in their approach. They were not reckless during the course of the event. They continue to monitor and work forward. And I must ask you to think in your deliberations about unintended consequences. If you are minded to impact the licence and change the conditions, would that impact upon these other events which have taken place for so many years so well and without issue? As Michael Golightly explained to you, in actual fact, the distinction between the free high-level days and the other 3 days of operation, the proms, etc., because the background levels is hardly distinguishable on the ultimate dB figure of 60, 65, 66, 67 decibels being emitted, because it is already operating, as you've heard from Gareth, at a level which is below undertaken in other authorities of 75 decibels. Turning to the law, you have the guidance, and I have extrapolated into the written submission various paragraphs. You also have your own policy document. This site is outside of your community of impact area, but again, we have no evidence of antisocial behaviour arising or crime and disorder, which are the main draws to create the CIA. The main paragraphs I would ask you to consider are 9.43 in connection with evidence. The decision must be based on evidence before you. You have in the bundle provided by the premises licence holder scientifically undertaken noise level testing. It is not subjective, it is objective evidence as to the noise which was being experienced on Marygate and also at Westminster Road, and then within that statutory framework where it sits. And that is without doubt unrefutable evidence as to the position of noise. And then that takes us to the question as to whether that noise was nuisance, and was it then public nuisance. And our robust submission to you is that those boxes are not ticked. We do not have nuisance on the evidence, and we do not have public nuisance on the evidence. I would also ask that you look at 11.17. When you are at a review hearing, it is usually because things have gone wrong in the past. This site is not subject to any warnings, as has not had any previous infringements. And the evidence of your learned officer is that the infringements on the first and second day were such that they were indiscernible to a human ear, therefore not impacting on amenity. The evidence is clear that the premises was well run. I would ask you to look at 9.12, listening to the voices of those who are experienced in the field and understand noise, and that the evidence that they have put before you, along with the conditions and the paragraphs around proportionality and the appropriateness of conditions. I couldn't have put it better myself, as Michael Golightly said, the conditions on the licence currently are enforceable, they work, and they are a good, robust set of conditions for promotion of the licensing objectives at this site for the community within which it sets. We would ask you not to amend the licence and allow us going forward to work again very closely with the relevant authorities to improve the noise management plan, to improve the execution, whether it's by stage changes, increased leafleting, looking at how communication is achieved, but to permit the premises to continue to undertake events of this nature. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to invite the subcommittee. Do you have any final points of clarification? I've got a couple of questions to ask. Just we've talked about the background noise is already close to 50 decibels. So this event is not so different to the other 3 days of the year when we have the lower threshold events. So therefore, do we need to differentiate between the 3 events that are at the lower threshold and the 3 at the higher threshold? Do we need to have the higher threshold events?
Yes, you still do, because some of the locations. Yes, you still do, because some of the locations, obviously, it wouldn't be feasible to run an event like this. That they'd then be in breach of the premises license. So that's the problem. That what you're trying to do is, if you say it's going to be 15 dB above background, then at some locations, yes, it would have been exactly the same, but at other locations they would have breached, and that's the problem.
Okay.
So it's putting too much pressure upon them to achieve that level at every location.
Okay. And then my other question was, would there be any way of giving greater notice to people with neurodiverse conditions?
I think as we've put, there's learnings, and Future Sound are very experienced in promoting these events. It could be that there's different engagement with the local press. York Mix, is it York Mix, have picked up on the review, and it may be that we could engage with them because they have a wider circulation. So information can go out in different ways. So it's just not reliant on somebody, as I do, picking up the leaflets that go through the door and put them straight into the recycling bin. Learnings from this could be to look at alternative lines of communication and tapping into other resources, whether it's through the council itself or other media sources. And that's something which can definitely be explored. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. So I think that brings us to the end of the public part of this hearing, and we will now reconvene in private for our deliberations. And the full decision that we come to will follow in writing within 5 days of this meeting. Thank you, everyone. Ready to go?
Yeah, good to go.
Okay. Thank you. Welcome back, everybody. So members have deliberated the case that was put in front of us today, and we've resolved to go with option 6, which is to take no action. But we do recognise that the applicant has taken learnings from this case, and we encourage them to consider some of the mitigations that were discussed during the hearing today, such as the arrangement of the stage and the direction it's facing, and the leafleting and communications that go out prior to the event. We'd also like to recommend that our licensing committee here at the council considers our policy in relation to neurodiversity, which we think came out of today's hearing and is something important that we need to look at. So that's all I've got to say for now, and the full reasons for our decision will follow in writing. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.